All right. David, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Can I already put you to work and ask you to introduce yourself? And then feel free to launch into the presentation. But thank you so much for all the prep work you've been doing for this.
Of course, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is David Ballard. I'm the Associate Director of Narrative Strategies at the Groundwork Collaborative. We're based in Washington, D.C. I use he, him pronouns, and I am originally from Orlando, Florida. I was born and raised, and have been in DC now for about 6 to 7 years, doing like a variety of different economic policy jobs, mostly about like communication, and like how to take topics that are super wonky and complicated and needlessly detailed and try to translate into something that people can just like generally understand and can feel like encouraged and empowered in our narratives and our conversations. That's how I typically take it. I don't have a policy background. So it's actually been a huge asset for me in doing this kind of work. So I'm very excited to talk with you all a little bit. To give you like a brief overview, I have some slides. I'll move through them pretty quickly. And if you all have any questions as I'm talking, please feel free to just jump off mute and ask and interrupt. Like I think we can keep this pretty informal, but we are going to keep the bulk of the time at the end for questions and answers. So I'm happy to, you can wait then if you'd like to do that. And also, just want to like make a note. I do not promise to have every single answer to any question you have. But if I can make notes and try to at least track down resources or put you in the right direction for someone who could answer, if I'm not like the right expert. But just wanted to say that from the outset. And thank you all for joining. So I'm going to share my screen. See if I can get this right. Okay. Go on. I think that's going. Do we see a slideshow?
We do.
Awesome. Okay, great. So yeah, I am going to talk through how Groundwork, I'll give you like a brief overview of Groundwork, how we think about narratives and constructing narratives, and going to focus mostly on using the Republican tax bill that just passed through Congress and was signed by President Trump last week as an example of how we tried to do this, and hopefully offer some tips and some ideas for how to continue the fight. Just because it passed does not mean that this is over by any stretch of the imagination. So definitely want to make sure that we can be useful. Quick roadmap. So I'll go over some like top line tools and strategies that we use when we're trying to construct narratives, whether it's about the tax bill or about, we did a lot of work on Doge. We primarily focus on economic issues, but these are just like a few things that I've always found really useful and have been helpful in applying like the day-to-day work. Then I will offer up some polling and recent message testing that kind of guided how we apply these things to the issue of the day with this tax bill. And like I said, we'll make room at the end for questions and answers. So a quick overview of Groundwork. We are, I think, a pretty unique organization in Washington, D.C. We're pretty small, about like 20 to 25 people. So we like to be pretty nimble, and we focus on only economic issues, and even then, a pretty narrow set of economic issues. But I think we're pretty unique in that we think really, really proactively about narrative, and we kind of like wake up every day thinking about like how can we best communicate about the economy, what is happening right now, how it's being felt by people in their daily lives. And part of how we like do that work is by following this worldview that we call, which we see in like three parts. First part is that one of our goals to create an economy that works for us, that works for people, is to build public power. That means things like unions, co-ops, tenant organizations, things like that, ways that people can exercise power that are not just through that are that not just corporations get to exercise. The second point is curbing private power. We think that a lot of the reasons why the economy is not working the way it should be is because private actors like corporations, like billionaires, like very wealthy people, use their power and influence to their power and wealth to influence our political system and our economy. And then the third bucket is we really are, like I said, trying to build an economy that works for us. We think that if people are not thriving, if the economy is not working for people, then the economy isn't working. We don't look, numbers like the GDP and stock market and macroeconomic figures are really useful as a tool to talk about how the economy is working, but it's not the definition of how the economy is working. So we try to construct all of our narratives to reinforce these three parts so that people understand what we think a progressive, equitable economy actually looks like, and why today's economy isn't that, and how to get to that vision of a better world. So a few different things that we use to do this work. First one is frames. So basically, the way that I like to think about this is like actually using like a picture frame. Oftentimes people talk about like in art or in photography or in anything, what's included in the frame is often as important as what is excluded from the frame. So we think about, like what are we trying to emphasize? What are we trying to explain? What are we trying to leave unsaid? I think like the most important part of the framing when we figure out how we're going to apply it to our work is making sure that we are not repeating our opposition's frame. So often, I think progressives get in a spot where they have to explain over and over again why something is wrong or why that's incorrect or whatever it may be. And what ends up happening is that you just repeat over and over again and you play on their turf. And so what we want to do is assert our own narrative rather than spend so much time explaining why somebody else is wrong. That can always be, it's always useful and we have to do that, but that's like as a pivot to what is it that we're trying to build? What is it that we're trying to change? Two ways that I think help put the frames into practice. Number one is like picking our heroes, and then I'll go over in the next slide, picking our villains. For our stories, we think of it in a very like literal sense, like who is the main character of the story that we're telling? Who are our heroes? Like I was talking about in our worldview, the protagonists of our story are regular, ordinary people. It's workers, their families. You can get as specific as you like, you can go as broad as you like. But I think one important distinction is that our hero is not government. We are we want to build public power. We think that government has an incredibly important role to play in creating an economy that works for people. But government is supposed to play, in our view, a supporting role. Government sets guardrails. It offers tools that the protagonists, the people can use to then go build their own lives as they see fit, the life that they want to see for themselves and their families and their loved ones. The goal is not to lift government up as a hero. I think one really fascinating example of this that I can track down and share, there's research about this and we can share in the wrap-up email, was about the child tax credit, which was temporarily expanded under President Biden a few years ago. And there's research that found that one of like the main frames that the Biden administration, a lot of advocates, including myself, I did a lot of work on the CTC, used was talking about how expanding the CTC will cut child poverty in half. And we saw that, I was like, that's huge. That's excellent. How could anybody possibly be against this? But the research found that at best, that frame didn't really convince a lot of people to support the child tax credit. And it was because it put government in the main character slot. It was saying that government was the one that was cutting child poverty in half. And a reframe that they found in message testing that was more effective was saying that expanding the child tax credit gives parents the tools they need to bring their families out of poverty. So I think it's a really perfect example of what we do when we say that Government exists to give you the tool for you to be the protagonist, and you go and bring your family out, figure out the best way for you and your loved ones to build a better life. It's not necessarily about government coming in and saving all of these people. Because one of the big things that we see as a problem in getting to a progressive worldview is fighting cynicism, and fighting this idea that people feel like I don't have any power, I don't have any control over this, so why would I even engage in the first place? And we have to make sure our stories are encouraging people to take agency and to see themselves as like active participants in both their lives and also the economy. I think another way to do that is by identifying and communicating about the right villains. At Groundwork, we really believe that having a villain is like very, very important in the story that you're telling. It's important, like I said, to have protagonists, but people, when you describe something going wrong, when you describe the economy as like a designed system, as a system of like policy choices, people naturally ask, well, then who made the choice to break it? And I think it's really important to offer people an explanation for that, to offer them a point where say like, this is who broke it, and this is like how they did it or why they did it. This is like the action. It's not just like a character attack. We have to offer a clear explanation. Offering actions like what they did is really important to getting people to feel, again, like agency, because it continues to reinforce like this is the result of actions. This is a result of decisions. And if people made one decision to create a tax code, for instance, that hands out trillions of dollars to the largest, richest corporations, then we can theoretically choose a different tax code that invests in people, invests in workers and in families, and makes the people who earn the most in this country pay their fair share. I think the last thing I'll say about this part, and then we can move to the Republican tax bill as an example. There's some really interesting research from an organization called the Frameworks Institute. And for the past few years, they've been they measure mindsets and like how people think kind of generally about the world on a variety of different issues. And one survey they've been running for the past 5 years has found that on the economy, people are increasingly believing that the system is rigged. They call it the system is rigged mindset has become close to dominant. Nearly 70% of people believe that the people who are successful in the economy are, it's because of like these laws and policies and systemic decisions. Is not necessarily because of individual actions. It's not because of individual effort. People are starting to see that I can work really, really hard, and that does not guarantee that I'm going to get ahead. Sometimes I can do that and I can fall behind and I earn less than my parents. And that mindset is really crucial and important. But it's nuanced and it's delicate. There's like some good aspects of this because it encourages people to think of the economy as a designed system, as something that, like I said, can be changed. But it also, if you don't prime people's agencies, like if you don't center them as the protagonist, if you don't give them a villain to explain why it's like this, people can feel disempowered. And when people feel cynical, when they feel like there's nothing really going to change, they retreat into themselves. They understandably think the goal here is to make sure that me and my family are okay. I can't think about anybody else. And when society is in a mindset like that, you see some of the results we've seen for the last couple of years, right? Like for instance, in the past election, people start to feel like they're not out here to help me, so I'm just going to try to get what I can get, and I will do what I can do, and I can't take care of everybody else. So I think it's really important that we tell stories that are like show who is the hero, who is the villain, and that this is the result of decisions and choices, and give people a path forward to see how they can be part of a different decision being made. So I can Excuse me, there we go. Last thing on this, I think, like I've repeated myself many times already, it's important to be simple and repetitive. I think that's part of how our narratives can really stick with people. We're in an economy and in an information ecosystem now with social media, a bunch of different ways that people get information, that capturing attention is really one of the main goals. Like, how do you get people to see the thing that you're saying over and over and over again? Research shows that the more that someone hears something, the more likely they are to believe that it's true. So we want to make sure that, like, on the GOP tax bill, tax cuts for the rich are paid for by everybody else, can be reiterated over and over again. So on this Republican tax bill, I'll give you like a brief overview in case folks aren't as familiar with it. But this passed last week. This comes from a poll that was released at the end of May, which was after the House had passed the bill, but before the Senate. But we think it's still really relevant to discussions currently. And we found that, like, unsurprisingly, defunding SNAP, defunding Medicaid, making the cost for low-income households is extremely unpopular. People are extremely concerned about who is going to be impacted by this. You know, children are at risk of losing school meals. They're at risk of losing meals like at home when they leave school. Lower and middle class households are going to see their costs go up. Groceries, healthcare, utilities is another big one. These are all the leading concerns and leading impacts that we found consistently over message testing and polling since the bill was introduced and was moving through Congress. And I think it's more evidence to show that we are right to use a frame that puts people at the center of it. You know, to put aside more abstract concepts and arguments, like maybe like the deficit, put that to the side, and instead keep the focus on the impacts of real people, because it gives you an opportunity to talk about, to make them the protagonist, and to make sure you're telling a story that centers them and lets people see themselves in what you're talking about. We also found, and something that we've like gotten a lot of partners to agree with, and will continue to push as the impacts start to roll out, and the people who voted for this bill hear from their constituents about how they feel about it. We are going to be encouraging people to talk about the fact that this is going to have a devastating impact on already high prices. We really believe at Groundwork. Also, sorry, I have not been following the chat. I don't know if anybody has been asking questions, but yes, you'll be able to catch the replay. So at Groundwork, we believe that talking about affordability is one of the best ways to get your narrative out there, because it's important to meet people where they are. We've seen polling for years at this point now that the top economic concern for people is the rising cost of living. It's prices on groceries, it's prices on healthcare, it's prices on housing, it's prices, period. And the more that you can talk about whatever is maybe moving in Congress, something that can feel difficult to translate into like real language, the more that you can do that and link it to where people are already prioritizing, the more likely it is that it's going to actually be heard by people. We think that that's, I write a newsletter every month, and I'll send out a sign-up form in case you're interested and you'd like to read it. But in our latest edition, we talked about Zohran Mamdani's campaign in New York City, and you know, his surprising success. And to us, a big reason he was able to go from 1% name recognition at the beginning of the campaign to winning double digits against an established, very well-funded front runner was because he was able to capture attention. And the reason why he was able to capture attention is because he focused on affordability. And he focused on taking issues that people already talked about, already thought about, and connecting them to his campaign. I think the same thing applies here when we're talking in C3 terms, 501c3 terms about policy changes. The more that we can capture attention, the better it is for our narratives to take hold. And if people are already paying attention to high prices, we should go to where they are. We found that this also outperforms the argument from Republicans on this bill. All Americans will have their tax cuts. This is like a core piece of common sense that we try to fight against a lot. People assume that tax cuts automatically mean good things for the economy. It's based in this like 40 to 50 year long story about trickle down economics. That like if government would just get out of the way and cut taxes for people, businesses can really do what they need to do and people will thrive. And I think that a lot of us on this call know that there's huge holes in that story, and it's not necessarily true. But it is still a sticky common sense kind of assumption for a lot of people. And something that we try to do when we're trying to enact a narrative change, we see it as if we can take the day-to-day work, the things that are happening right now, and use that to also chip away at these longer term narratives that we feel are really damaging for trying to build a progressive economy. That's like peak. That's like the best version of this work that we can do. To simultaneously try to win the short-term fights, as well as set ourselves up on the long term so that when progressives do come back in power, they're on better footing to pass the kind of policies that we need to create an economy that actually works for people and not the rich and not large corporations. Last slide that I'll also say, and then we can open it up to questions, and I'm happy to talk through anything else, is you should feel confident that the arguments that we're making are winning arguments. Yes, like the bill passed, that is obviously a devastating result. I do not think the fight is over. It is now, the fight has just shifted to making sure that people understand what the impacts actually are. And as they start to feel the impacts, as their loved ones and their communities start to feel the impacts, it's on us to connect those impacts to the reason why, to explain why that's happened. And you should feel confident that the argument that we have to make, that they are cutting Medicaid, they are cutting SNAP, they're raising prices in order to pass tax cuts for the rich, is very persuasive, and people believe that. They intuitively understand that. And the eliminating fraud, stopping benefits, work requirement stuff, it doesn't necessarily work. So that is my general spiel. I would love to answer any questions you all have about narrative stuff, kind of at large, but also about the bill, and anything else you all are curious about.
Awesome. Thank you, David. That's some amazing information. I'm glad it's on video so I could rewatch some of it and digest it. And I definitely have a lot of questions. Want to try and take questions from everyone else first, assuming there are just a couple things. If you try and make sure it's a question for David, that'd be fabulous. And if you'd limit it to one question at a time so we can have as much time for people to ask questions as possible. And then assuming everybody's gotten one, if they want one, we can go back around for a second round. And David, if you wouldn't mind turning off the screen share so we could see all the smiling faces, those who are off camera, welcome to stay off camera. You're welcome to come on. It's always nice to see a human face if you can. And just a reminder that we are the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, so we're trying to produce well-being as we do this work. So hoping that we will have a joyful experience. And David, thank you again. David Abramson, would you like to go first?
Sure. Lots of Davids here.
There are.
Um, no, I'm curious if you do you run campaigns like in marketing, in the marketing world? That's where I come from. There's like funnel building, that kind of thing, but not directed towards money, but directed towards guiding people through some kind of journey to understand the narrative. So I'm curious, like how much you do in that space with funnel building.
A great question. I haven't heard the term funnel building. That's new for me, so that's very interesting. So Groundwork, I think, is pretty unique. I've worked on campaigns before. In my previous role, I did a lot of public comment campaigns, trying to get people to submit comments against Trump administration cuts back in the first term to SNAP and to Medicaid. And so I've definitely, and then before that, I was an organizer on political campaigns at the presidential and congressional level. So I think that there are like interesting parallels between the process of trying to reach an audience member, explain to them why they should care about the thing that you're talking about, and then also motivate them to like take action. The audience member or the audience that Groundwork I think uniquely cares about is actually members of the press. Like we consider the media not just as a means of distribution to get our message out to other people, but we consider the media as an audience in and of itself to be influenced. Like that these are people who have viewpoints and have worldviews, and that they have their own understandings of how the economy works. And if we can have conversations with them that are less about trying to get included in a story or get a clip, though obviously we want that. We would love clips. We love to do that. If we can have conversations with them to help them understand like why we are making the arguments we make, why we see the economy work the way it works, then the idea is that for news cycles to come, we're influencing how they're reporting on it. And that then can influence general public or can influence elected officials and their staff who are reading these economics reporters. So I think it can be like difficult to measure, and that's something I always really struggle with when it comes to narrative change, because it oftentimes takes place not just over years, but sometimes over generations, and it can be really difficult to sit here and be like, my action this one time in summer of 2025 was the reason why this thing happened 10 years. That's not, you can't do that.
Right.
But I think that it's still really important to be trying to reach these media members. And part of how we decide to measure it then is like less so on, does this specific story take the specific angle, or are we building like relationships with a broader range of reporters on a broader range of topics, a broader range of outlets? We're doing a lot of thinking about new media outlets. Like a lot of people get their news now from influencers and from people on TikTok and people on Instagram and YouTube and Reddit. How can we reach a broader set of people who are seen as the ones who are giving information to the public? Yeah, Substack is another great one. Yeah, exactly.
That's really helpful to understand how you're doing it, David. Erin, glad you could join today.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm also in Washington, D.C., and my feeling after this bill passed is I was feeling pretty hopeless about fighting for Medicaid and SNAP, so I appreciate that you haven't given up. But my thought was like, if I were designing a policy platform, which I'm not, but if I were in that position, would it not be more strategic to just focus on universal programs rather than means-tested programs? Because it seems so easy to divide people. And what they didn't cut was Medicare and Social Security, which maybe because of other reasons, but my assumption is at least part of it because everybody sees themselves as having a stake in those programs they didn't cut. So yeah, I guess that's my question is, how do we help people feel like they have a stake in programs if they don't see themselves as poor? Or do you see opportunities for expanding programs in a way that would impact everybody? I was just like brainstorming what might be possible that we could provide everyone, like short of going to a fully, universal healthcare system. Maybe we could start with universal primary care. Maybe that would be a way to help, build a sense of solidarity It's just like, as a country, we've lost or never had, that sense that we're all in this together, and that these policies are for everyone.
Mhm.
Thanks.
I think that's a great question, and it's something I think about a lot. I know that I hope I get his name right. I think I believe his name is Dr. John A. Powell, who's a professor at UC at Cal Berkeley, and there's a really interesting research institute there where he's talked a lot about this concept that can be used to apply to policy design called targeted universalism, and the idea is to there's this like kind of two competing goals with what you're talking about. There's like one hand, we want to make sure that the resources and the investments we're making reach the people who are in greatest need first. But also we want to build strong enough political will to make sure that they're politically durable and that they don't get stigmatized like SNAP has, like Medicaid has, like TANF or like welfare was, and then became TANF, and then is now it's like it still provides some help, but it's not anywhere near as effective as it could be. And targeted universalism, I think, is a really interesting concept that tries to thread the needle between both. I definitely do not. I'm not a policy expert. I can't. I can't speak to, should we be pushing for Medicare for all? Should we, be pushing for Medicaid for all? Like I leave it to the healthcare experts to do that part. But it could be useful to look into some of his work on that question, which I think is wrestling with the same thing that you're talking about. I think the other part, as far as like here and now, how do we get people to care about things that they may feel don't apply to them? I've been really encouraged, as devastating as the result of this whole campaign and fight has been. Like I remember when I started doing anti-poverty work in 2018, we had to be extremely conscientious about how we talked about SNAP and Medicaid and these programs that were serving low-income people, because we were fighting up against narratives where like people thought that like this is going to undeserving people, and we were very scared of triggering narratives that would backfire on us. And I think that there's a lot of polling we've seen consistently over the past 6 months as Medicaid cuts have been talked about, that a lot of that has actually fallen to the wayside. And I can share more research in the wrap-up email. Navigator Research has done some really excellent work on this that shows that people very much understand that Medicaid serves low-income people, and they are glad that it does, and they think that it should be doing so. And if anything, the funding should be increased. It feels like in the past few years, there is like a shift happening amongst public opinion, where I think that people are starting to see through this affordability crisis, this cost of living crisis, that even if you're working 2 jobs, you're not making ends meet oftentimes. And I think people understand there's this idea of solidarity, that they don't feel that the Medicaid recipients are undeserving of it. They think that it actually is serving a good purpose, and that's what government should be doing. That's not to say that there's not still obviously lingering stigma and things that we need to be like very mindful of as we're communicating. But I think that we're in a better position now in arguing for these programs and these policies and these viewpoints, these philosophies, than maybe we were 7 years ago, or maybe we even like deep down believe we actually are today. It's been it's an interesting process just for me personally to actually like sit and believe like, no, people really do think that Medicaid is good, and we can lean into it and defend it with our full chest, and say that it should be not just protected, but it should be expanded, funding should be improved.
I'm going to insert a question, and then whoever wants to go after me, just let me know. There's so many interesting points you brought up. I feel like I could talk about this for another couple hours, but in pointing out the villains in some of these things, the potential is that some, we're trying to look for actions for people to take, right? And, or at least, we want to change the worldview. And I think we're trying to change policy by electing different leaders. And some of the progressive leaders are going to get caught up in some of the bills that they've approved or some of the things they've compromised on, and wondering, like, what is the action that you want to take, or what do we do about when our side, however you might want to view that, is getting caught up in the backlash to the thing that you're, um, the story that you're trying to influence?
That's a good question. I'll say I'm here in my 501c3 capacity. I do not work for any candidate,
No problem.
anything. I come at it purely from like a policy and advocacy perspective. And I think that it's really important to sometimes like preach to the choir and to hold your friends accountable when they like step out of line. And if I think it's really important muscle to like develop and to build, especially when you're out of power, to like keep that going, because you need to be able to flex that muscle when you are back in power and people want to listen to other interests that, maybe we don't want them listening to. So like the more that you can, I think, to me, I see it as like, as an advocate, I see it as like genuine practice, like getting better at that, getting more comfortable, having those conversations, drafting those kinds of communication materials, thinking through those strategies. But it's also like, kind of like I said with the media, talking about David's question, like it's also like building relationships with those people so that when the time comes in a few years, or whenever power does come back to people, they hear you as like a trusted person, and they hear you as someone who's like been singing from the same songbook this entire time. I think that there's like very delicate ways to do that, to make sure that you're not breaking trust and that you're building trust with them. But I do think there are definitely times where you have to hold someone accountable if they're making really bad decisions. And if they're not listening, sometimes you have to get them to pay attention. So that's going to look very different for every single person and every single organization. I totally leave it up to you to figure out what that looks like. But I definitely think I just see it as like a relationship that you'd have with like anybody else.
Yeah. No, thank you. You explained it so well. Brian.
Okay. I don't really have direct questions type of thing. I just have some thoughts and I want to bounce it off your head just to get a better understanding of where you're coming from. What you said about making the government the hero rather than the people the hero, to my mind, explains a lot the failure of the Democrats.
Opposite. Make the
Okay.
people the hero, government.
Right. No, I mean that. Make people the hero. Because Biden and Kamala Harris tried to make themselves, we made these changes, we did this, we did that. A lot of people I felt didn't really feel connected to them, okay? And because they weren't answering the questions they wanted to have answered or feeling their pain, we got wiped out, okay? I think that's an important lesson to learn. So I really like what you said. It seems to me that you're creating narrative spaces that are larger than the people they might contain. And then if people come in and out, that narrative space stays and can last over time. And as long as it's kept given some energy, it can persist. It's also existing in opposition to other narratives, like the slide you showed where they're 36% and we're 58% and we're obviously stronger. The challenges with those, though, their 36% is allowed to use disinformation, misinformation. And not only that, there is an underlying narrative that's been existing in this country for decades, which people now just take for granted and don't even think about anymore. And we have to overcome that as well. And I try to be a systems thinker, and I think in terms of the systems thinking iceberg, which nobody knows, it's structures at the bottom, patterns on the above that, and then mental models. You guys seem to be going after the people's mental models. You seem to be trying to find some way of reconfiguring those to be in line with what the beliefs are of the entire narrative. The challenge I also see is that progressives seem to concentrate just on patterns, going out and holding rallies, doing other things, going like that. Conservatives concentrate on structure. They changed the structure of the Supreme Court. They changed the structure of voting rights. And I think that's something else we have to look at. And the last thing I want to bring up for you to give me some thoughts about, you talked about how a narrative has emphasis and explanation. And these are aspects both of the narrative, but they're not necessarily tied together. Emphasis, what you emphasize and what you explain may not be attached. And if they're not, I think you're going to lose something. I think you're not going to be able to implement what you want, the changes that you want to see, unless people understand what physically has to change in the world for something to come about. That's okay, just off the top of my head. All right, thank you so much.
No, of course. That's very interesting. I think that you're like spot on when it comes to like the mental models. You're talking about this idea of like these stories are unconscious, you know, like people just see it as like, well, that's just like that's how the world works, you know, is like I think like one that's really interesting is this idea that I don't know if people would use this metaphor necessarily, but I think it gets at what the thought is, that people see the economy as like the weather, like it's something that's outside of all of our control, and it's something that like happens to us and that we have to experience and persevere through. But there's not really a lot of changing that. And so I think that the way to try to change those mental models, which you're right, we are very obsessed with trying to change those mental models, is first by trying to get people to understand in as careful and strategic way as possible that the story that they believe is no longer serving them, and that it's no longer true, if it ever was in the first place. And I think that there's I wrote about this in this newsletter this past month. That work is really important, and it also can be dangerous because sometimes it like triggers a lot of shame, you know, that somebody feels like, oh, did I just like get made a fool of? Like, am I getting, and people don't like to feel like they're wrong. I don't like to feel like I'm wrong. Obviously, I want to feel like I'm right all the time. And there's like a way to provoke that reconsideration in people without necessarily making them feel bad about themselves or making them feel small or condescending, because that's just going to encourage people to hole up and disengage entirely, you know, or it's going to trigger some defensiveness, and they're going to be even less open to hearing the things that you have to say. To me, one of the ways to help do that is by identifying a villain, and that's one part, identifying a villain. So it's not just like give it some explanatory power. And then two, which I think you were also getting at, Brian, like the narrative being larger than like that specific individual, like there's room for people to come in and out. I think it's important for you to make room and to emphasize on like other people have believed the same thing that you believed, and they are now changing their minds because they've seen this information, and trying to get folks to understand like this is like a social thing. Like we are all doing this together. Again, like it's another way to prime systemic thinking, you know, it's another way to prime collectivism. And this idea that like, it's not just me getting taken advantage of. It's a lot of people who are like me in a lot of different ways. And also a lot of people who are extremely different than I am, but we have this thing in common, you know? And the more that you can get people to see the similarities with their peers, whether that's across class or whether it's across race or gender or religion or whatever it may be, the more that you can prompt those kinds of thinking, I think like the more powerful our coalition is going to be. So I hope that's helpful at all, but it's really interesting thoughts. Thank you.
That's pretty amazing. Thanks. I want to do another hour just on that. Stacy, go ahead.
Uh, Thanks so much, David, and well, David and David for organizing and presenting. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. My question is about, I guess it kind of builds on some stuff that Brian said, but I appreciate the value of getting down to a really simple message. And, related to this bill, you're talking about kind of this raises prices, costs for people, and it's bad. But my concern is about endorsing that too much, because then when it comes to other things, it's like, well, you said, it's important not to raise costs on people, but now we want to spend money on something and we need to. And so, in the case of the basic needs costs, I think there's a conflict between just endorsing this idea that prices should be as low as possible and the idea of paying a living wage when it comes to food industry workers, care industry workers, things like that. So I see some problematic long-term things around a simple message like that. And I think that there are kind of two ways that, things that we should question. So instead of endorsing this idea that prices should be as low as possible, why don't we work on trying to focus people on thinking about why don't so many people have the resources to pay for these basic needs or whatever else it is. So it's not questioning the prices themselves, but the ability to pay them. And other kind of things that go under the radar there are, what is the role of government? Is it a redistributive system? That's what we're looking for. Or are we looking for a system that sets fair enough rules so that everyone can afford basic needs without relying on redistributive policies? Things like that. So I guess that's a bunch of questions kind of all balled up into one, but it is about like, what do we accept as givens because that's the way people are thinking now and try to leverage those? And what way do we try to dig a little bit deeper into the systemic problems when we're thinking about narrative?
That's a great question. It's also very helpful feedback, because I don't want the takeaway to be, it's helpful feedback for me and how I'm communicating, because I don't want the takeaway to be necessarily that we think prices should be as low as humanly possible. I think, though I can obviously see like how that gets construed, with what I was saying. So I think it makes total sense. I like fully agree. And I think that, it's something that we wrestle with a lot at Groundwork, because we have this framework that we sometimes use when we're thinking about identities and how people see themselves and how they move through the economy. There's like 3 different buckets. We see people as like workers or retirees. We see people as consumers, people who are like, buying products, engaging in the market, and then we see people as citizens. And I think that what you're getting at is exactly right, because we focus a lot on the consumer part. We focus on the fact that cost of living is extremely difficult for people. And there's been some interesting research that finds where people have asked, like, prices are really high. To solve this problem, would you rather see prices go down, or would you rather see your pay go up? And people have kind of consistently said they'd rather see prices go down, which is like a challenge, for us, I think, in the long term. But I think that there are ways to talk about, to like walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can right now in this moment, prices continue to be like the dominant concern and priority for people. That if we are able to use that as a lead-in to then talk about prices are really high, and part of the problem is because, for instance, like something that Groundwork has done before I got there, I can't take any credit for it, but they did a lot of work on greedflation, and the idea that like much of the inflation, especially over the post-pandemic period, was driven in part by corporations who were price gouging, and they saw that some prices were rising, so they said, I can raise prices too because people will pay it. And so we want to use like the rising prices as like a way in to then discuss the role that like corporations are playing, and that the prices are an example of. They're raising prices while keeping worker pay low, and cost of living continues to go up, but pay is not going up. There's a way that you can do both, and you can have that secondary conversation. But I think it also depends on where people are in the moment. And I think that we've talked about some like policy solutions like to get at this, that we try to expand beyond just prices, but like, you know, like banning or regulating stock buybacks, and in implementing price controls on particular products and in particular moments, that they don't think they fully reconcile the point that you make, but they start to try to say like it's not just about getting the prices down, but it's also questioning like the role and the power that corporations and these very wealthy CEOs have in setting how the economy works. That can then, I think, lay the foundation for having conversations about the role of unions and the role of like increasing pay for workers and protecting them at the workplace, like like a lack of safety, and also like from discrimination. I think there's a way that you can use the conversation to build on top of one another. I don't know if that's actually addressing what you're saying, but I hope it does at least. I understand your point. I think it makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think we have time for only one more question. So Brian, if you don't mind, I'm just going to see if there's anyone who hasn't asked one yet, wants to ask one. If not, I'll defer to Brian. And okay, Brian, it's all yours.
Yeah. Do you collaborate with other organizations at an organizational level?
Yes, we do a lot of collaborations
Okay.
on a bunch of different issue areas. We tried, part of how we see success, one of our main audiences is obviously the media, but it's definitely not the only audience that we have. So we really tried to think through, like, is there research? Is there resources that we can offer to partners who are maybe tangential to the issues that we're focusing on, to help them incorporate it into the work that they do? I think that's been really useful in talking about like Medicaid cuts and tax cuts kind of generally. There's a lot of people who are like, I know that I'm going to get involved in the tax cut fight in this tax bill because it's going to impact Medicaid, but I'm not necessarily an expert on taxes. So Groundwork tries to be a convener and offer like, we have a lot of tax expertise like within the organization, but we're also friends with a lot of folks who are tax specific orgs. And so whenever we can be a convener and a connector between like, here's the healthcare folks and here's the tax folks, let's all get on the same page so we're like singing from the same songbook. We think that that's the best way to get like the same simple, repeatable, sticky narrative out there.
Right.
So,
And I'll add to that too, that you're working with Akira Nakahara and Wellbeing Economy Alliance and other groups that are focused on narrative work. And you mentioned, I'm going to get the name wrong, but the Frameworks Institute or another group. So yeah, I think there seems to be a lot of collaboration. And that would be my last question would be, how do we support the work that you're doing? How do we help uplift it up so that you're having even more success in converting and expanding those messages?
That's a great question. It's a great question.
You don't have to answer today, but some food for thought. So
yeah. Let me think it through. I think that like sharing resources is always really useful, and like lifting up opportunities when you see like, hey, I think that this is actually pretty in line with like what y'all do. Is there an opportunity to collaborate? And we are like a pretty small org. We're about like 20 to 25 people, and I'm on the narrative strategy team, which is currently a team of one, and it's just me. So I have only so much time in a week, but I think that like trying to find ways to collaborate, and especially as the impacts from the bill begin to roll out, and it's pretty complicated. There's a bunch of different the timeline is very long and very specific for a lot of different impacts from the bill. So I think one of the challenges and opportunities that advocates have is to be like really clear about like when those start to hit, connecting those things over and over and over again and building a drumbeat. Connecting it back to the tax bill will be really important. And so collaboration on that front, especially as we're like talking to people like on the ground, we're like, my food bank closed because of this, like this rural hospital closed because of this bill. I think will be really, really important.
Great. Well, I hope everyone will join me in expressing gratitude to David. This was really helpful to me in a time of, so many things going on and sometimes feeling like, but just knowing that your group is out there doing this work and trying to convince the media and other groups feels so, I don't know. I'm just lifted up and more hopeful thanks to you doing work and just you explain things so clearly. And really, I have about 20 more questions in case you ever decide to spend another hour with us. All right. Thank you, everyone. And
Thank you, everyone. It was so lovely to meet you all. Appreciate